Before the moon landing, before Sputnik, before NASA, before countdowns became television ritual and rockets became the architecture of modern power, one machine rose from a frozen field in Massachusetts, stayed in the air for 2.5 seconds, and changed the future. It did not look like the future. It did not sound like the future in the way people now imagine the future should sound. There was no cheering crowd, no floodlights, no brass band of national prestige, no clean room, no mission control, no stitched flag on a pressure suit, no steel gantry lifting a monument into the sky. There was only a farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, a strange machine with its engine on top and its tanks below, a handful of witnesses, a man who had spent years being doubted, and an experiment so brief that, if you blinked at the wrong time, history would seem to have done almost nothing at all. 2.5 seconds, 41 feet high, 184 feet downrange. That was all. And yet that tiny, awkward, stuttering flight proved something the modern world would never be able to unlearn. Liquid-fueled rocketry could leave the ground, sustain thrust, and point toward a future larger than artillery, larger than weather balloons, larger even than the imaginations of most of the people alive in 1926. The space age did not begin in a single glorious leap. It began in a brief test that looked almost too small to deserve the burden of prophecy. But that is often how real beginnings work. They arrive before the costumes of destiny have been made for them. This is the story of those 2.5 seconds. It is also the story of the man who made them possible, Robert Hutchings Goddard, a physicist, dreamer, obsessive experimenter, and one of the strangest kinds of historical figure. A person whose ideas were so far ahead of his time that his contemporaries often treated him as foolish, impractical, or embarrassing, only for later generations to build whole worlds out of the things he had already proved. But this is not simply a biography, and it is not only a technical history of propulsion. It is a story about how the future really begins. Not with certainty, but with ridicule. Not with institutions, but with one mind worrying a problem until it becomes a life. Not with the polished language of inevitability, but with improvised hardware, scarce money, skeptical newspapers, failed tests, burned metal, private notebooks, and the stubborn refusal to surrender an idea simply because the age around it is not yet ready to understand what it has seen. To understand why those 2.5 seconds mattered, we have to begin before the launch itself, before the frozen field in Auburn, before the gasoline and liquid oxygen, before the launch frame and the cabbage patch, before the word rocket could be spoken in the United States without inviting a smile. We have to begin with a boy who looked up. Robert Goddard was born in 1882 in Worcester, Massachusetts, and like many children who later become symbols of technical genius, he was not simply curious in a general way. He was seized by a particular kind of curiosity, the sort that turns ordinary objects into experimental invitations. He was fascinated by flight, by height, by energy, by motion, by all the stubborn questions hidden inside the phrase, how do you get something off the ground and keep it going? His health was often poor in childhood, and periods of illness kept him indoors, which may have deepened rather than diminished the intensity of his imagination. Solitude can do that. When the body is restrained, the mind sometimes learns to travel in ways the culture around it does not yet approve of. Goddard read widely, and among the texts that mattered most was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. To later generations, Wells would become one of the great myth-makers of modern science fiction. To the young Goddard, he was something even more dangerous, proof that imagination could become technical ambition. That distinction matters. Plenty of people can dream of traveling to other worlds. Fewer decide that the dream is an engineering problem. Goddard did, and once he did, he could not really stop. He would later describe a formative moment in 1899, when as a teenager he climbed a cherry tree to prune dead branches and experienced what he remembered as a kind of revelation. Standing above the ground, looking out across fields and trees, he imagined a device that could rise into the sky and perhaps travel beyond the earth entirely. The story has the kind of symbolic neatness historians are always tempted to distrust. Yet some lives are so fully shaped by a long obsession that even their origin stories, however polished by retelling, still contain a deep truth. Goddard spent the rest of his life trying to solve the problem he glimpsed from that tree. how to create a machine that could carry itself upward not by borrowing the atmosphere, but by carrying what it needed within itself. That idea sounds obvious now because we live after it. In Goddard's day, it did not. To understand how radical his thinking was, we have to remember the mental world of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Flight itself was still new. Heavier than air aviation was barely becoming real. Powered airplanes had not yet matured into common military or civilian tools. Long-distance communication was still transforming itself. Electricity, chemistry, engines, metallurgy, these were active frontiers. The culture of engineering was alive with possibility, but the possibility of space travel still belonged, for most educated people, more to fantasy than to any respectable scientific forecast. Goddard's brilliance was that he did not treat the problem as fantasy. He treated it mathematically. In 1914, he received two important patents. One was for a rocket using liquid fuel. The other was for a multistage rocket using solid fuel. Those two patents alone would be enough to secure him a place in the genealogy of modern rocketry, because they show how early he had already grasped principles that later engineers and states would build into systems of enormous consequence. Multistaging would become one of the great structural logics of spaceflight. Liquid fuel would become the backbone of modern launch vehicles. Goddard was not merely thinking about making fireworks better. He was thinking about the architecture of leaving the Earth. But thinking is one thing. Building is another. At his own expense, and with stubborn personal commitment, he began methodical experimental work. This was not glamorous work. It involved fuels, combustion, materials, calculations, nozzles, stability, and the endless tension between theory and failure. In 1916, he sought support from the Smithsonian Institution, and the result was a path-breaking study later published as a method of reaching extreme altitudes. It was a technical document, not a manifesto, but buried within its reasoning was something the public seized on: the possibility that rockets might one day reach the moon. Here we arrive at one of the cruelest recurring patterns in the history of science. The public rarely mocks the real substance of a difficult technical argument. It mocks the part that sounds most absurd when separated from the chain of reasoning that supports it. In Goddard's case, the phrase that stuck was not high-altitude research or propulsion mathematics. It was the moon. The idea that a rocket might reach the moon was enough to invite laughter, and some of that laughter became notorious. Journalists treated him as a dreamer untethered from practical reality. The New York Times, in one famous 1920 editorial, dismissed the notion in language that later generations would remember with embarrassment. What matters for our story is not simply that Goddard was ridiculed. It is that the ridicule had consequences. It taught him to distrust publicity. It taught him that the world could seize on the most speculative edge of a scientific proposal and use it to discredit the hard work behind it. And it helped push him into a style of research that would remain curiously private, guarded, and often isolated. This isolation is one reason Goddard is harder to narrate than some later space pioneers. He did not build an empire of publicity around himself. He did not found a mass movement. He did not preside over giant institutions or national laboratories in the way later rocket figures would. He worked, often with too little money, too little recognition, and too much suspicion. His notebooks were detailed, his imagination vast, but his public world was narrow. That narrowness slowed him. It also preserved the purity of his obsession. By the early 1920s, he had turned seriously toward liquid-fueled propulsion. This was a decisive move. Solid-fuel rockets had long histories, of course, but liquid propellants opened different possibilities. They offered, in principle, greater control, greater efficiency, and greater scope for sustained powered flight. They also introduced terrifying complexity. Now you were dealing not only with ignition and combustion, but with storage, delivery, pressure, cooling, mixture ratio, feed systems, stability, and the behavior of intensely reactive substances that were not inclined to forgive engineering errors. Goddard chose gasoline as fuel and liquid oxygen as oxidizer. It was a combination at once practical and dangerous, the kind of pairing that belongs to the history of real engineering rather than the mythology of clean invention. He began experimenting seriously in 1921, and over the next several years he refined engines, tested components, and pushed toward the question that mattered most. Could a liquid-fueled rocket actually fly? The answer was not obvious. Even if the mathematics were sound, The hardware might fail. Tanks might leak. Feed systems might falter. Stability might prove elusive. The structure might tear itself apart. The engine might burn through. Ignition might go wrong. The whole machine might become a brief, humiliating burst of noise and smoke with no future beyond the headlines of people prepared to sneer. He kept going anyway. That anyway is the real engine of this story. Not inspiration. Anyway. Not vision alone. Anyway. Not certainty. Anyway. In the years leading up to 1926, Goddard refined a design that now looks strange to anyone familiar with later rocket forms. He placed the engine above the fuel and oxidizer tanks, a configuration opposite what later became standard. He believed this would give the rocket greater stability. By modern standards, the design was awkward, but modern standards do not exist until someone survives enough awkwardness to create them. Then came March 16, 1926. Aunt Effie's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts. Frozen ground. A launch frame. A small team. Robert Goddard. His wife Esther. A few close associates. A machine the world was not waiting for, because the world did not yet know what it should be waiting for. The rocket was later nicknamed Nell. It stood on its frame with gasoline and liquid oxygen loaded into it, a dangerous vertical argument against public doubt. The launch itself did not go perfectly. Even the moment of ignition carried uncertainty. Goddard later recorded the event in a tone so understated it has become almost famous in its own right. The understatement matters because it captures something rare in historical turning points. The people inside them often do not speak in the grand language later generations attach to them. They are too busy making the thing work. When the rocket finally rose, it did not soar like a myth. It climbed. It cleared the frame. It arced. It flew for 2.5 seconds, reached 41 feet in altitude, and landed 184 feet away in a cabbage field. By the standards of later spaceflight, those numbers are almost microscopic. By the standards of 1926, they were enough. The rocket had flown. Liquid-fueled propulsion was no longer just theory. The future had become experimentally real. It is hard now to recover the emotional scale of that shift, because we live among the descendants of that proof. We know the line from Goddard's field to V, 2 missiles, from V, 2 missiles to Cold War launch vehicles, from those launch vehicles to Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, uncrewed planetary exploration, space telescopes, space stations, and the giant boosters of the present. We know how much of the modern world, not only in exploration but in warfare and state power, would come to rest on the ability to throw machines through the sky using liquid propellants. We know all this. Goddard in that field knew only that the thing had worked. But that is how most revolutions begin. One proof before the world knows what it will cost. The launch did not make him famous overnight. It did not trigger a tidal wave of government support. It did not suddenly reorganize American scientific culture around rocketry. In this sense, the history is almost disappointing. We like origin stories to produce immediate recognition. They rarely do. Goddard still had to keep building. He still had to improve stability. He still had to solve steering. He still had to refine placement and control. He still had to secure money. He still had to work in a country whose political and military establishment remained far less interested in rocketry than later memory might suggest. After additional tests, he recognized that placing the engine beneath the tanks, rather than above them, simplified the design and provided adequate stability. That revision alone says much about him. He was not a prophet defending a sacred form. He was an engineer learning from evidence. The first flight mattered because it proved liquid propulsion could work. The later work mattered because it transformed that proof into a developmental path. And once the problem became not just thrust but controlled flight, another frontier opened: guidance. A rocket that leaves the ground is impressive. A rocket that can be steered is a different order of thing entirely. Goddard understood this. He experimented obsessively with stabilization and control. He used movable vanes in the engine exhaust. He explored gyroscopes as guidance tools. He worried not only about how to rise, but how to control attitude and direction once in flight. This is where his story becomes even more modern. The first liquid-fueled launch is the headline, but steering may have been his more overlooked contribution. Clark University's Centennial material stresses this point for good reason. The ability to guide a rocket's path is one of the foundational problems not only of spaceflight, but of modern aerospace systems more broadly. Even today, guidance is destiny. A rocket is not just combustion. It is controlled combustion aimed through space. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Goddard's work gradually outgrew Massachusetts. The combination of technical ambition, need for larger test areas, and the possibilities opened by outside support pushed him toward the landscape with which another phase of his life would become associated: Roswell, New Mexico. That sentence lands differently to modern ears than it would have in the 1930s. Roswell is now saturated with later mythology of flying saucers and extraterrestrial folklore. But for Goddard, it meant something simpler and more serious: space, weather, relative isolation, and room to test machines that were becoming larger and more capable. Getting there required help. Charles Lindbergh, already a towering figure in American public life after his transatlantic flight, became an admirer and advocate of Goddard's work. Through Lindbergh's efforts, the Guggenheim family provided significant funding that made expanded facilities in Roswell possible. Without that intervention, progress might have been even slower and more precarious than it already was. Roswell gave Goddard a new environment for invention. There, in the 1930s, he and his team worked on more advanced rockets, towing them out behind simple vehicles, setting them on launch stands in the desert, refining engines, testing gyroscopes, exploring control systems, and slowly building a body of work that anticipated much of what later rocketry would become. The images from Roswell are extraordinary precisely because they are so unmonumental. There is something almost comic to modern eyes in seeing the father of American rocketry towing experimental rockets behind a Model A Ford. Yet that is exactly the point. The future often begins looking provincial. And still, progress was slow. Partly this was technical. Rocket engineering is brutally unforgiving. Partly it was financial. Goddard never had the level of sustained institutional support that would have transformed his research into a large national program. Partly it was political. The United States government before the Second World War showed only limited interest in his work. And partly it was personal. Goddard's distrust of publicity, reinforced by earlier ridicule, made him cautious about exposure and protective of his intellectual property. This protectiveness was not paranoia in the abstract. It had reasons. He knew his work mattered. He feared theft, appropriation, and misunderstanding. He and Esther even took care to have notebook pages notarized. He lived with the sense that he was working on a problem ahead of his country's willingness to support it and ahead of the public's ability to judge it fairly. That combination can produce a difficult temperament. It certainly produced isolation. His highest rocket altitude in this period was around 9,000 feet. That number might sound underwhelming if one thinks only in terms of later achievement, but altitude alone is not the best measure of what he was doing. He was creating a technological grammar: propellants, chambers, nozzles, stabilization, guidance, feed logic, structural lessons, and operational practice. He was writing in hardware the language later systems would speak more fluently. This is one of the hardest things for public memory to grasp about pioneers. The later spectacle often obscures the earlier grammar. People remember the moon landing. They remember Saturn V. They remember V2s raining down on London. They remember Sputnik. They remember astronauts. They rarely remember the years when someone had to make the verbs of a new age physically possible. Goddard worked in the verbs: lift, feed, ignite, stabilize, steer, recover, repeat. And while the United States government remained slow to grasp the significance of his efforts, others were paying attention. NASA's historical materials note that Germany and the Soviet Union studied his results. This is one of the most haunting elements in the story. The same work that laid foundations for space exploration also fed the development of military rocketry in states that understood more quickly than Washington that propulsion, guidance, and long-range flight could reshape power. This dual legacy belongs to almost every major technology of the modern era. The line between exploration and warfare is often not a line at all. It is the same research seen through different state priorities. Goddard's rockets prefigured the future of spaceflight. They also prefigured the future of missiles. That tension belongs in the story because the space age was never innocent. The machine that carries instruments beyond the atmosphere and the machine that carries explosives across borders are technological cousins. Liquid-fueled rocketry opened both futures. Goddard himself dreamed beyond war. His imagination was aimed upward, but history is not obligated to use an invention according to the nobility of its maker's hopes. And here lies one of the bitterest ironies of his life. During his lifetime, the United States did not fully convert his research into a national project equal to its long-term value. Yet later generations would elevate him, correctly, as a foundational figure. NASA named the Goddard Space Flight Center after him in 1959. He would become enshrined as the father of American rocketry. His patents and technical ideas would be recognized as astonishingly prescient. The respect came, but much of it came after the most lonesome and difficult parts of the work were already over. There is also another figure in the story who deserves more than a passing mention: Esther Goddard. Behind a great many technical pioneers stands a person whose labor does not fit easily into heroic public memory, because it is administrative, archival, practical, or emotional rather than easily theatrical. Esther documented, supported, preserved, and protected her husband's work. After Robert Goddard's death in 1945, she continued to safeguard his legacy, helping ensure that later generations could see the coherence of what he had done rather than watching it disappear under the reputations of later rocket men backed by larger states. This matters because historical credit is fragile. Once a technology becomes geopolitically important, it tends to be narrated through governments, races, wars, and giant programs. The solitary or underfunded pioneer risks becoming a preface, a quaint footnote before the real story begins. Esther helped prevent that from happening completely to Robert Goddard. So what, then, did those 2.5 seconds actually start? The easiest answer is modern liquid-fueled rocketry. The better answer is that they started the practical era in which the dream of leaving Earth could no longer be dismissed as pure fantasy. That is a subtler claim, but it is more important. Goddard's launch did not put a payload in orbit. It did not reach space. It did not send instruments beyond the atmosphere. But it changed the status of the problem. After Auburn, the question was no longer whether liquid-fueled rockets could work in principle. The question became how far, how high, how controllably, how reliably, and for what purposes. That shift, from whether to how, is one of the most powerful transitions in the history of science and engineering. Once a difficult thing is shown to be possible, the structure of public argument changes. Skepticism does not vanish, but it is forced into a narrower lane. Money can still be withheld. Institutions can still be blind. Nations can still fail to act. But possibility itself has become experimentally armed. Goddard armed possibility. This is why I think the space age in the title is justified, even if some historians might prefer to reserve that phrase for later milestones such as Sputnik in 1957. If by space age, we mean the age of political and cultural awareness that humanity can put machines, and then humans, beyond Earth, then yes, Sputnik is a defining public threshold. But if by space age, we mean the technological age in which that future became materially possible through liquid propulsion, guidance, and sustained rocketry, then Auburn in 1926 belongs at the beginning. The age began not with a nation looking upward together, but with one scientist proving the machine that nations would later race to master. The modesty of the launch is part of the lesson. The first liquid-fueled rocket did not announce itself with grandeur. It had no audience large enough to distort it into theater. It was all engineering, risk, and witness. That purity helps us see something that later spectacle often hides. The future begins before culture knows how to market it. The same is true, in smaller ways, of many great turning points. The first powered airplane at Kitty Hawk looked frail compared to later aviation empires. The earliest electronic computers looked ridiculous beside later digital civilization. The first recombinant DNA experiments did not resemble the biotechnology industries they helped create. Invention begins in forms so narrow, so contingent, so imperfect that later generations struggle to believe they are looking at the real beginning rather than merely a rehearsal. But the rehearsal is the beginning. And Auburn was no rehearsal. It was the first liquid-fueled rocket flight. Even the technical oddness of that first machine teaches us something. Goddard placed the engine on top because he was solving stability in the language available to him. Later he changed the design. That evolution reminds us that pioneers are not prophets delivering finished truth from the mountaintop. They are experimenters entering a space of partial understanding, revising themselves in public or semi-public as reality answers back. The future is not granted whole. It is corrected into existence. So too with guidance. The romantic version of rocketry imagines escape velocity, blast, upward force, and heroic ascent. Goddard understood early that ascent without control is not destiny. It is accident. The gyroscope, the movable vane, the effort to command attitude and direction. These belong to the same world as inertial guidance, stabilized flight, and the controlled trajectories on which modern rocketry depends. Goddard was helping solve not just how to go up, but how to go where intended. Without that second problem, the first remains mostly spectacle. This is one reason his work belongs so deeply to the modern world. Our age is not merely an age of power. It is an age of controlled power. Energy without steering is terror, waste, or noise. Goddard helped make steering part of the future of flight beyond the atmosphere. Yet the tragedy of his life is that he did not live to see the age he helped begin become fully visible. He died in 1945, the same year the Second World War ended, before Sputnik, before NASA, before Yuri Gagarin, before John Glenn, before Apollo 11. He did not live to watch the moon become a destination rather than a punchline. He did not live to see his center named, his reputation institutionalized, his field nationalized, and his ideas refracted through the greatest technological competitions of the 20th century. There is something almost unbearably sad in that. A man spends his life proving that a door can open. He dies before most people step through it. And yet perhaps that sadness is inseparable from the dignity of the thing. Not everyone is permitted to live in the world they helped create. Some are condemned, if that is the right word, to remain citizens of the threshold. Goddard was one of those threshold figures. He belonged to the moment when the moon could still get you mocked in the newspaper. He also belonged to the moment when a rocket could finally answer the newspaper by rising off the ground. In later years, the New York Times would formally acknowledge its error after the Apollo era made the old editorial judgment impossible to defend. There is a temptation to treat that retraction as a neat moral ending, the establishment belatedly apologizing to the visionary it had misunderstood. But the deeper meaning lies elsewhere. The point is not that the newspaper was foolish in a comical way. The point is that entire cultures struggle to take radically new possibilities seriously until machines make the argument undeniable. The history of innovation is full of people who were not believed until hardware embarrassed opinion. Goddard belongs to that lineage too. But his story also warns against the habit of narrating innovation as solitary genius alone. Yes, his imagination was unusual. Yes, his mathematical and engineering insight were rare. But his survival as a researcher depended on institutions, modest subsidies, benefactors, advocates like Lindbergh, collaborators, technicians, and the labor of documentation and preservation carried forward by Esther. The modern cult of the lone inventor often hides the fragile support systems that make sustained work possible. Goddard's life, if read honestly, shows both truths at once: the power of unusual individual conviction and the vulnerability of that conviction when institutions are slow to understand it. The field at Auburn in 1926 is therefore more than a site of technical breakthrough. It is a scene in which several histories cross. The history of imagination becoming engineering. The history of ridicule becoming proof. The history of American underinvestment in its own pioneers. The history of military and exploratory futures sharing the same technological roots. The history of the 20th century learning, very slowly, that the sky was not the ceiling. And because this is a documentary about beginnings, we should linger a moment longer on the exact strange elegance of the numbers. 2.5 seconds, 41 feet, 184 feet. Most great public achievements are narrated in larger numbers. Thousands of miles, millions of dollars, tens of thousands of troops, billions of viewers, giant budgets, giant structures, giant populations. These numbers make it easier for us to feel historical importance because they flatter our instinct to equate scale with consequence. Goddard's launch asks us to reverse that instinct. It asks us to understand that some of the most consequential events in modern history are not the ones that look largest in the instant they occur. They are the ones that shift what becomes thinkable, buildable, and repeatable. A machine can be tiny and still reorganize a century. That is what happened in Auburn. And the century that followed would indeed be reorganized around rockets. Within decades, rocketry would become central to warfare, surveillance, deterrence, prestige, and planetary imagination. States would pour treasure into it. Engineers would turn it into giant national systems. The line from Goddard to later German rocket development is not the whole story, but it is a real line. So is the line from those wartime technologies into post-war American and Soviet space programs. So is the line from those programs into civilian science, lunar exploration, interplanetary probes, Earth observation, communications, and the launch systems that still define access to space today. NASA's recent centennial framing makes this explicit. Liquid-propelled rockets became the backbone of spaceflight. That statement is simple, but it captures the meaning of Auburn. The launch was not great because of how far it went. It was great because of what kind of engine it proved could go at all. Modern launch vehicles still descend, conceptually and technically, from that proof. Different scales, different materials, different pump technologies, different guidance sophistication, different propellant management, different institutional worlds. Same underlying family. That continuity is what transforms a field test into world history. It is also what gives the title its force. 2.5 seconds that started the space age is not merely rhetorical. It is a way of training the eye on the right moment. Not the most famous moment. Not the most photographed moment. The right moment. There is another lesson hidden here too, one that matters beyond rocketry. The future often depends on people who can tolerate looking ridiculous for longer than the culture thinks any serious person should. Goddard tolerated that. He tolerated small audiences. He tolerated misunderstanding. He tolerated slow progress. He tolerated the humiliating pace at which institutions awaken. He tolerated years in which the work seemed to matter most to him, and only faintly to everyone else. There is a kind of courage in that which our culture is not always good at honoring, because it lacks spectacle. We celebrate the launch, the landing, the visible success. We are less good at celebrating the stubborn private years in which a person keeps working despite the possibility that recognition may come too late, or not at all. Those private years are where the future is actually made. If we strip away the later mythology of the space age, the moonwalk footage, the heroic posters, the giant boosters, the rhetoric of mankind reaching the stars, we find at the base of it not grandeur but patience. Not a finished system, but a sequence of hard-won experiments. Not national certainty, but one man and a few allies trying to make controlled liquid thrust real in a world not yet inclined to reward the effort. That may be the most human part of the story. Robert Goddard did not begin the space age because he represented a triumphant civilization already sure of its direction. He began it because he worked through uncertainty better than the age around him did. He did not wait for the culture to become visionary first. He built the thing that would force the culture to catch up. And that is why the image of him standing beside the launch frame in Auburn remains so powerful. He looks, to modern eyes, almost modestly placed beside the machine. The rocket itself does not dominate the sky. It barely dominates the frame. Nothing about the scene says world historical inevitability. That is exactly why it matters. The image catches history before it knows how famous it is going to become. The launch frame has its own symbolic power too. It survives in museums and archives as a reminder that beginnings are scaffolded. You do not launch the future naked into the air. You build supports, braces, temporary structures, awkward frames. The frame is not the future, but the future does not rise without it. Goddard's whole life was like that, constructing frames sturdy enough for an age not yet born. Today, when we watch a rocket leave the pad, we see fire, thrust, engineered grace, telemetry, and a whole bureaucracy of competence. We rarely see the hidden ancestry of that competence. We do not see the years when someone had to learn how to keep a chamber from burning through, how to stabilize a vehicle, how to make guidance more than a fantasy, how to transport experimental machines across rough ground, how to keep notebooks meticulous enough that ideas could survive their maker, how to protect inventions from ridicule, indifference, and appropriation. But all of that is in the flame, whether we remember it or not. Every launch is full of dead labor. Every successful system contains the ghosts of its first improbable attempts. And in the case of spaceflight, one of the most important ghosts is Robert H. Goddard standing in a field in 1926 watching a machine rise for 2.5 seconds. It was not enough to satisfy the dream. It was enough to change the status of the dream forever. That is the difference between fantasy and engineering. Fantasy asks whether. Engineering answers, watch. By the time the modern world learned to watch rockets seriously, Goddard had already done the hardest part. He had made the idea real while it still looked too small to matter. So when we say that the space age began there, we are not diminishing Sputnik or Gagarin or Apollo or the giant institutional achievements that followed. We are locating their hidden root. Public ages have private beginnings. The space age's private beginning was a brief liquid-fueled flight over a frozen Massachusetts field. And perhaps the most fitting way to end is to return to those numbers once more. 2.5 seconds, 41 feet, 184 feet. A machine rose, curved left, and fell. A newspaper culture that had laughed at lunar possibility had been answered, not with rhetoric, but with combustion. A lonely research path had crossed into proof. A man who had spent years trying to convince the age that rockets belonged to more than fantasy had just forced the age to accept the first physical sentence of a new language. And once that sentence was spoken, history would spend the rest of the century finishing the paragraph. The moon landings, the missile age, the space race, planetary probes, communication satellites, Earth observation, orbital science, Artemis, the entire modern grammar of launch and ascent. All of it exists downstream from the moment when liquid fuel first lifted a rocket off the Earth. That is why these were not just 2.5 seconds. They were 2.5 seconds that changed the world.